I'm gonna be down there one day.
Jerking off his flaming Sharpay?
Ranked in the top 10. Number 1 in the top 10.
Jesus Christ, who wants that kind of pressure?
It would have been easy for Gen V to completely fall apart. A spin-off of The Boys that drops right in the middle of peak everything is a universe now fatigue, while audiences are already burned out on franchises, stretching themselves entirely too thin. And then the pitch comes in, college kids coming of age with superpowers. The premise is something so familiar that it immediately elicits cynical eye rolls. It just felt like The Boys light. The same ideas repackaged with dorm rooms and relationship drama. Instead, Gen V pulls off one trick that most spin-offs completely miss. It knows it's not here to replace anything. It became one of the most successful spin-offs made, all in the face of one horrific real-life tragedy. The Boys is all about the finished product. Celebrity superheroes, media manipulation, corporate power, the absolute worst people on Earth being treated like gods. Gen V goes the opposite direction. It's a story that asks, how did they even get there? And that's where Godolkin University comes in, which is honestly one of the smartest additions to this universe. Because once you see the idea of a Hunger Games-esque university, it feels obvious. Of course there's a school and a system in place to take these unstable, superpowered people and shape them into something marketable. And obviously, a corrupt corporation like Vought International would industrialize that process. And what you get is this weird, uncomfortable mix of college life and corporate grooming. These aren't just students, they're products in development. Every class and ranking is tied to how valuable you'll be to Vought when you graduate. It's not what kind of hero do you want to be, it's what kind of asset can you become to our larger enterprise.
I just want to be a good person. But Marie, you are not a person. You are a product to them, a freak.
As an audience who grew up on shows like X-Men the Animated Series or comic books like Generation X, we know what this idea can be. Kids working together and becoming a found family while learning how to control their metaphorical powers. Gen V, at least on a surface level, does not do that. You've got characters figuring out their powers, sure, but more importantly, they're figuring out how to package those powers, how to brand themselves, or how to survive in a system that's already decided their worth before they even understand who they are. You're not watching gods destroy cities. You're watching kids realize they're being turned into those gods, whether they want to be or not. Every character is being pushed into a version of themselves they're not fully comfortable with yet. Not in a coming-of-age sort of way, but in a you will either become what this system wants or it will crush you sort of way. And that tension is what drives the entire ensemble. Take Marie, who functions as the closest thing the show has to a central perspective. Her power is immediately one of the most visually striking and uncomfortable in the series. Blood manipulation sounds cool in theory, but the show forces you to sit with what that actually means. It's invasive, violent, and it's tied directly to her own personal trauma in a way that never really goes away. The show goes out of its way to tell her again and again that it is a disgusting cross for her to bear. So Marie isn't just learning how to be a hero, she's learning how to make people accept what she can do.
Don't worry, there's not going to be any gotchas. We won't mention your sister.
Whoa, what do you mean?
And that's a very different journey, because in a traditional superhero story, powers are usually something you grow into. Here, it's more like she's negotiating with it, trying to figure out how to present something inherently unsettling as something marketable. That's a reoccurring theme across the entire cast. Jordan, for example, has one of the most conceptually interesting abilities in the show, shifting between forms that each come with their own strengths. On paper, it's incredibly versatile. In practice, it becomes another thing that needs to be simplified, packaged, and sold to an audience that doesn't care about nuance or spectrums. There's a constant push and pull between identity and branding.
What do I always say, huh? Being a hero, it's not about the glory. It's about
sacrifice.
And then you've got Emma, whose power is tied to her physical size in a way so gimmicky that it's almost a joke. When we first meet Emma, she's trying to reckon with a past that exploited her as a novelty. Only instead of being the subject of some roadside circus, she's the modern equivalent to a childhood star. It's one of the clearest examples of how Gen V takes something that could have been played solely for comedy or spectacle and reframes it as something deeply uncomfortable and important as body acceptance. Everything in Gen V is about characters learning to present themselves to the world. When we first meet Kate, the telepath, she's literally keeping herself at arm's length to avoid control.
You know, I could take my glove off and make you. I won't. because I'm all about consent.
Even Andre fits into that system in a way that feels deceptively familiar at first. He's got the legacy angle, the expectation, and sense that his path is already mapped out because of who came before him. But the show doesn't treat that as a straightforward advantage. If anything, it takes a deeper and longer look at nepotism and how it can be its own kind of pressure. Because legacy in this world isn't about living up to something noble, it's about maintaining a brand, and that brand is infinitely more valuable than the actual heroes themselves. The more time you spend with these characters, the clearer it becomes that none of them are really in control of their own narratives. They're reacting and adapting while trying to survive something that's already bigger than them, which is why the ensemble approach is so important, because no single character could carry that entire idea on their own. It needs Marie's perspective as an outsider trying to break in, it needs Jordan's internal conflict around identity and perception, and Emma's struggle with self-worth being tied directly to how she's consumed, literally and figuratively. Andre has to reckon with his position within the system itself, someone who's both benefiting from it and slowly realizing how broken it is. They're all different bits of the same problem.
I'm superhuman, right? Made of steel.
And that's what makes the world feel cohesive instead of fragmented. It's also what allows the show to build tension without constantly escalating scale. Because the real stakes aren't just, will they survive this situation? It's, what will they have to become in order to survive? That's a much darker and relatable question, and it's one the show keeps coming back to. Even the way it connects back to The Boys reinforces that idea. The characters from the main show don't show up as mentors or saviors, they show up as proof. Proof of what happens when you make it through this system and what success looks like on the other side. There's an expression about making partner in a law firm that says it's like winning a pie eating contest with the trophy being a pie. That's the end result of Godolkin's ranking system. Stomp on and humiliate your friends and yourself in servitude to vaught for a lifetime of servitude to vaught. Every compromise feels like a step closer to something they're not sure they want to be.
Shut up, television Jason Ritter!
You have to kill him!
And that's where the show really locks in its tone. It's not just cynical for the sake of cynicism, it's a targeted and specific critique on how people lie to themselves in order for approval, or in the show's world, a high ranking. How quickly the show found its voice and tone made everyone incredibly excited when the show was greenlit for a second season, and then subsequently heartbroken just before filming was set to begin. In March of 2024, Chance Perdomo tragically died in a motorcycle accident while heading to Toronto to start filming the second season of Gen V. Andre wasn't just another piece of the ensemble, he was a key part of the show and how the show explored legacy, expectation, and complacency within the system. Losing him meant losing one of the clearest connections between the student experience and the larger machine of Vought International. That's not something you can just rewrite around easily. This is usually where things fall apart, because the instinct is to fix it through some sort of workaround, the most obvious of which would be recasting. With the absolute utmost respect to any recast actor out there, it is hard trying to imagine someone else taking the mantle of Andre Anderson. He had a chemistry with the rest of the cast that just felt like they all genuinely knew and liked each other. That's not something you can just rewrite around easily. Instead, Gen V decided to rewrite the season around Andre passing as well. It allowed a real-world tragedy to exist within the story and let the crew and cast deal with their grief in conjunction with the fans. Andre's absence becomes part of the narrative fabric in a way that feels organic and natural. It changes how characters interact because they all feel a different level of responsibility. We learn that Andre died from medical complications after he tried to move the steel door of their prison. Throughout the season, we find out that Andre had medical records that showed this was happening when he used his powers, but everything was covered up because of his legacy.
Oh, and of course he didn't even tell you. He had what his father has, his neural micro tears.
The school knew that Andre took a risk every time he used his powers, but continued to encourage him to do so simply because that was more valuable to them. Because the show was already built around multiple perspectives, it has the flexibility to absorb that loss without collapsing. Marie's perspective deepens while Jordan's internal conflicts become more pronounced. Emma's arc takes additional layers because the group's dynamic itself has changed. Even Andre's father, Polarity, takes on a larger role. With him stepping forward, the show still manages to address legacy and how Vought exploits people in order to get what they want. And that unexpected turn ends up reinforcing one of the core ideas the show was already exploring, that you don't get to to control everything.
I always told Andre he was made of steel, but he wasn't. He was flesh and blood. He was my flesh and blood.
Which makes the decision to ultimately end Gen V alongside the boys feels less like a limitation and more like a continuation of that philosophy. This wasn't a show that was built to exist in a vacuum. Without the anchor of the boys, Gen V is kind of listless, and the show is smart enough to recognize that, which is honestly kind of rare. There's a shambling version of this show that just keeps regenerating itself with new teens butting heads against an increasingly dark faculty. But that's exactly the kind of thinking Gen V was pushing against in the first place. The idea that everything has to keep going on and on, that every success has to be turned into something bigger and more bombastic. Oftentimes, the strongest move is to stop. Most spin-offs are built like insurance policies. You can feel that as you watch them because there's this underlying sense that the original show is either winding down or losing steam, and this new thing is being positioned to carry the torch. Gen V doesn't feel like that. If anything, it feels smaller and more contained, but in a way that weirdly makes the entire world of the boys feel bigger, because instead of trying to escalate the stakes, it shifts the perspective. And in that sense, the show itself kind of follows the same arc as its characters. It knows what it is and is completely happy to tell those stories, and it, above all else, knows when those stories are over. So, what do you think? What other spin-offs have worked so well or overcome as much tragedy? Let us know down in the comments below, and as always, thank you for watching Nerdstalgic.